Good afternoon, good evening, and Amar, good morning. My name is Chantal de Jonge Oudraat. I'm the president of Women in International Security, also known as WIIS. Welcome to this very special event, 1325 and Beyond. Today, the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is celebrated in the open debate in the UN Security Council at this moment, as well as at this moment in this webinar. To mark this 20th anniversary, WIIS, together with the Heinrich Boll Stiftung, launched earlier this year an international essay competition, asking people for new thinking on the women, peace, and security agenda. And I can tell you, we have not been disappointed. Our essay competition triggered many entrants, including a fair amount of entries from men, and many innovative and imaginative ideas and strategies to push the women, peace, and security agenda forward. Shortly, you will meet with 11 of the extraordinary contest winners. Unfortunately, 2 were not able to join us: Samuel Anthony of Nigeria and Chelsea Cohen from Zimbabwe. But we have 11 winners you will meet shortly. And again, congratulations to all of you. So our contest winners will talk about the importance of the WPS agenda, about new ideas, how to re-energize and revitalize this agenda. And they have really taken to heart our request for concrete recommendations. What can and should governments do? What should international organizations do? Civil society, the media, the private sector. One of the things that I really like about our group of winners is that it shows that there are many different ways in which we can approach this agenda. And secondly, what I really like is the diversity of voices from young scholars, young practitioners from around the world. And it really shows that diversity is a real strength. I would like to thank the members of our jury to help decide on the winners. And I can tell you this was no easy job. I would also like to thank my colleague Dominique Tolsdorf of the Heinrich Boll Stiftung for their enthusiastic support of this essay contest. And Dominique, may I invite you to say a few words?
Sure, yeah, thank you very much, Chantal. And yeah, hi, my name is Dominic Togsdorf. As Chantal said, I work for the Heinrich Boll Foundation's office in Washington, D.C., where I had the Foreign and Security Policy Program. And I also wanted to say a few words to thank you. First of all of you who participate today, and even more, all of those of you who have participated in the essay competition this year. A big thank you to Chantal and her team at WIIS for cooperating with us on this project, and for doing a terrific job in organizing the competition, the review process, the jury, the publication, the promotion, and all of this. You can really see you have a lot of experience in this field, and it was really a great pleasure to work with you. So thank you very much for cooperating with us on this. And it was also a great pleasure to be at least a little bit part of this project, and to see how much interest there was in, and first of all, how many people submitted an essay for the competition, and also from so many different parts of the world. And as Chantal already said, how many good ideas were brought up in this process. For me personally, I haven't been very familiar with the discussions on the topic, I have to admit that, but I also learned a lot during this project. And it's of course also a topic that aligns very well with the Boll Foundation and the principles and values of the Heinrich Boll Foundation, which is trying to promote gender equality or gender democracy, which is a term that's often used within the foundation, on different levels in its projects worldwide, and basically every office of the Boll Foundation. That is a big topic. And yeah, before I give it back to Chantal, I wanted to use the opportunity to also mention that my colleagues from the office in Brussels have also initiated a very interesting project this year, in which they have compiled a package of portraits of women from, I think, more than 20 countries that have been involved in the WPS agenda in the past 2 decades, and sort of portray them and also tell about their experiences in this process. And I don't know if I can share this link, but I could also just share the link with Kayla, and who could share it with all of you if you're interested in this. It's really great. It's a really great package of portraits. And yeah, thanks again, and I much look forward to the discussion, and give it back to Chantal here.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominique. And yeah, I think we can put these links in the Q&A or the chat function. Let me introduce you to my colleagues from WIIS. First of all, Kayla McGill, who's program manager and a fellow at WIIS and was deeply involved in this whole competition. And I would also like to introduce Roxana Veerami, in charge of our communications and outreach program, and did really a fantastic and terrific job on the video. So thanks to Kayla and thanks to Roxana. Kayla, can I invite you to explain to our audience how we are going to proceed?
Yes, of course. And I want to also reiterate my congratulations to everybody here. This was a wonderful initiative to be a part of, and this partnership with Heinrich Boll Stiftung was really a unique thing to be able to learn more about. I want to just give a quick overview. We, as everyone can see, we have 11 different people that are going to be panelists at this event for their work, and that's a lot of people. So what we did is we divided our panelists or contest winners into 2 different groups. What we're going to do is we're going to have a brief discussion with each group for about 20 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A portion that is opened up to the audience. We encourage you to type your questions right away, or if somebody said something during their portion that you want to follow up with later, we encourage you to type those immediately into the Q&A portion so we can get to them right away. During the group sessions, each group will be introduced by a short video that's approximately 8 minutes that will introduce the panelists and summarize their main arguments that they're making in their essay and their piece. We'll then ask each person a brief question, and we'll move to the next group and open it up, and then again open up to the general Q&A. We also encourage you to tweet about this event using the hashtags 1325AndBeyond, WPS, and Security, as Dominic mentioned with that initiative before. All of that information is now in the chat, and we encourage you to engage and continue to talk about this and share this volume as well. Thank you so much.
My name is Ana Velasco. I am a feminist security analyst. I participated in the 13 and Beyond competition with an essay titled UNSCR 1325 and the WPS Agenda, a feminist response to authoritarianism. My essay starts by acknowledging that 1325 has indeed reached a new generation of practitioners, activists, and scholars, and that is very good news. But we are also facing particular challenges, and some of them are very, very worrying. For example, authoritarianism. Let's say the return of authoritarian, masculinist, and at times militarist leaders. And with that is coming also a wave of misinformation. And obviously, the COVID pandemic. I make 2 proposals in my essay. So the first proposal is related to putting the NGO sector, the civil society, back at the center of the agenda. And by this I mean grassroots NGOs, in particular those with a deeply intersectional approach, both in the global north and in the global south. My second proposal is to incorporate journalists as protagonists of the WPS agenda. And by journalists, I mean investigative journalists, I mean small newspapers and local community radios. In sum, these 2 proposals privilege a decolonial and intersectional approach. As Ann Tickner emphasizes, true security cannot be achieved until power structures of gender, race, and class are eliminated or significantly diminished.
I'm Amar from Indonesia. I'm currently studying Master of Development Practice at the University of Queensland. I'm also a researcher at ASEAN Study Center, Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta. In this opportunity, I'd like to share a brief summary of my essay entitled The Women, Peace and Security Agenda in ASEAN, Progress, Gaps, and Ways Forward. ASEAN has been very progressive in advancing human rights and women's rights in the region, including the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Despite the vibrant progress of the WPS agenda in the region, countless actions are needed to ensure full participation of women in peace and security. I offer 3 recommendations to advance the WPS agenda in ASEAN. First, ASEAN needs to develop a feasible regional action plan, making it updated and compliant with the WPS resolutions, which encourages ASEAN member countries to develop its national action plan and also highlights the importance of civil society. Second, ASEAN should make use of existing institutions within the ASEAN community framework to implement the WPS agenda, including the ASEAN Secretariat, ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and ASEAN Commission on the Promotion and Protections of the Rights of Women and Children. Lastly, ASEAN should intensify cooperation with its development partners, the United Nations, and other multilateral organizations to support the WPS agenda implementation.
Hi, my name is Esther and I am speaking to you from Brussels today. I've just started a traineeship at the European Parliament. I'm going to talk about 3 main ideas which I put forward in my essay concerning the UN Security Council, funding, how to increase it and direct it the right way, and finally, climate change. First, the UN Security Council. We all know that the UN holds much power in bringing forward women, peace and security issues, but whatever it is able to do always depends on the willingness of member states. I therefore propose to make a country's track record on women, peace and security a factor in their election for non-permanent membership of the Council. The second proposal regarding funding, well, we don't have enough money. There's a need to increase funding for women, peace and security issues and to overcome short-term priorities and donor-driven agendas. And once we have more money, we need to direct it the right way. And for me, this means more funding for local grassroots women's organizations who know the field better, for women's participation in formal peace negotiations, and for qualitative research. Third and final point is the climate emergency. And I therefore proposed adopting a new Security Council resolution modeled on UNSCR 1325, which connects climate concerns with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Thank you so much for your attention.
Hi, I'm Andrea Timler, and I currently work as a regional security analyst. In my article, Escaping the Closet, Women, Peace and Security was already queer. I argue that the future of the WPS agenda must be more responsive to and inclusive of LGBTQ+ people by emphasizing gender, not just women, in its aim. I argue why it's especially important to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the future of this agenda. So first, I believe that including queer people in WPS makes WPS more legitimate in its claims to help all women, not just a certain type of women who are often defined by their biological or social roles as wives and mothers. Most importantly, though, I think that including queer people in the Women, Peace and Security agenda actively works to dismantle a patriarchy that's based on gender stereotypes. I think it's practically very simple, although it might be politically more difficult. My solution is to talk to and talk about queer people at all levels of power. So first, this looks like including queer people at the United Nations. Direct language about queer people in UN resolutions is key to norm development and funding allocation. Secondly, we need to include queer people in member country governments. The national action plans, I think, are a great area of entry to talk about queer people. Third and finally, at the local and civil society level, civil society organizations often have the most latitude to push for a queerer women, peace, and security agenda, since they're implementers and norm entrepreneurs. I believe that we're not having an honest conversation about gender and how it is constructed and experienced in conflict until we can have a conversation that includes queer people. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tamya Rebelo, and together with Paula Drummond, we have written the essay 1325 and Beyond, Moving Forward the Women, Peace, Security Agenda in Latin America. In our research, we found that there is a disconnect between the main principles of the Women, Peace, Security Agenda and the violent realities facing Latin American women. We argue, therefore, that in order to move forward, we need to take into consideration new ideas, language, practices that will allow us to think beyond the war and peace dichotomy that is diffused in most traditional understandings of the Women, Peace, Security Agenda. The first point we make in the article is that even though Latin America is often portrayed as a zone of peace, the region faces alarming levels of violence, and women and girls are among the most affected.
Considering that women and girls are the most affected by violence in Latin America, our paper not only exposes the patterns of violence that affect them, but it also criticizes how the traditional divide maintained in the region between public security on the one hand and international security on the other contributes to keep these issues out of WPS debates. The development of mechanisms to fund WPS programs and to monitor budget allocation is also vital to ensure the fulfillment of the agenda. And this is particularly concerning in the next decade, considering the economic and political crisis affecting countries in the region, which will be aggravated by the COVID-19 global pandemic. The recommendations in our essay highlight the need for supporting the development of new commitments and priorities through strategies that can be undertaken at the regional, national, and subnational levels. These recommendations, however, can only be achievable with sustained political will from governments, sufficient resources, and meaningful civil society participation. Thank you.
I thought that was, terrific. Congratulations to all of you. Kayla, do we have results of our audience poll?
Yes, we do. So nobody, just a couple little things, nobody said that there was no progress. So I guess that's very encouraging. 13 people, or 36%, said that it was too little progress. 58% said there was some progress, and then 6% that said that there was a lot of progress. So that's very interesting.
Okay, so let's go to our first group. What's your reaction when you see this actually fairly optimistic view of where the WPS agenda is? Do you agree with this? Anna.
Thank you. I guess I do, because I also voted for some progress. I'm trying to be optimistic here. So yeah, well, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation to participate here. And thank you very much to WIIS and the whole fantastic team there, and to Dominic and Heinrich Boll Stiftung. So yes, I agree. I think there are some steps that have been taken, and I'm glad that it's not only part of what it's been called the community that notices them, but also perhaps a wider audience. But I think there's also room to be cautious, and that will be very interesting to discuss, since no one said like it was completely like a complete success. So I think that gap is precisely where we can get into very interesting insights from everyone here.
Okay. Briefly, Amar, do you have a reaction on the poll? Do you are you yourself also in that optimistic camp?
Yeah, I would say I'm personally in the context of ASEAN. I would say I'm very optimistic that ASEAN would move forward in eventually, I would say, creating its own regional action plan on women, peace, and security agenda. But I guess it's also important to recognize that there must be some challenges and limitation at that point. So it's also important to find imaginative solutions to actually address the challenges and limitations in the future.
We'll come back to that, to the ASEAN issue. Just a quick reaction, Paula and Tamya. Are you surprised by our poll results?
Hi, thank you all. Thank you for the organizers of the event. Actually, we have debated a lot this specific point, where we fit between some progress and a more pessimistic view regarding the women peace security agenda. And we do think that even though we are facing a challenging situation nowadays with the political and economic crisis, even though this, we tend to look at the women peace security agenda from a historical perspective. And from this point, we can see some advance. So we recognize key actors that are working not only on the center stage of politics, but also most importantly on the backstage. And these actors are putting so much effort to move the agenda forward that we don't think the idea and debates about gender equality in Latin America will fade away so quickly, despite the moment that we are testifying nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Paula, do you want to add something to that?
No, I think Tamya pretty much touched upon what we have discussed when we received these questions, because we started putting together the mixed information that we have concerning pushbacks, but also advances. And in the end, we both agree that indeed we have advanced a lot. And we also, despite the pushbacks, and specifically when we look at Latin America, from the increasing engagement from governments, even the new action plans, the revisions that are coming up, and etc. So I think I also voted for some progress, and I agree with that.
Okay, Esther, you too?
Yes, I did also vote for some progress. I think we have good consensus here. However, I think there's definitely good reasons to be optimistic about the future of women, peace and security. Also because if optimism means having our eyes set on the more equal world that we want, that's definitely motivating. And if that can be a call to action, I personally see it almost as a civic duty to, remain optimism, to make sure that we can keep acting and bring about the meaningful change that we want to see. And I hope that this is what we're doing tonight to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Andrea, last quick reaction from you, and then we'll have some individual questions for each of you. Andrea.
Well, just to repeat what everyone else is saying, I am also really optimistic. I think the fact that we're all here with so many suggestions, and the fact that gender equality is still so much a major topic right now, I think shows that there is a lot of room for improvement. But I'm really hopeful because it feels like there is a large and growing civil society space to have these conversations. And just based on all of the videos that I just watched, it seems like we think that civil society is really where the future of this agenda is, and it seems to be thriving and full of new ideas. And I think as long as that continues, I'm optimistic that we'll keep moving forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me turn to Anna, and I think this is a very nice sort of follow on. Anna, in your essay, you write that the next decade, though, is going to be the moment of truth for the WPS agenda. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that and what you mean.
Sure, thank you. Well, I meant that in two senses. The first one would be as a change of generation, as new people, as the community, the so-called WPS community grows, and there are new people that are practitioners or in the academia that are trying to move forward with the agenda. I think that is important because, as has been noted many times before, the 1325 is very particular in the sense that it is probably the only UN resolution with such a family, with such a community or a constituency. So I think that change is very interesting to see, and we will see new developments, I think, in the coming 10 years. And on the other hand, I meant it as a moment of truth, just trying to play a little bit with the meaning of the information environment that we are facing now, and that is helping to actually it's helping the backlash against the agenda itself, the misinformation campaigns, and that is sometimes used on purpose by some leaders. So that's what I also meant, which is increasing in many countries, and I think we should pay attention to that.
Okay.
And Amar, I'm going to ask you the next question, moving on to you. So in your piece, you are urging ASEAN to adopt a regional WPS action plan. How likely do you think it is for them to adopt that?
Yeah, I guess as I said earlier, currently ASEAN is progressing in a way that ASEAN leaders are adopting this joint statement on promoting instead of like implementing women, peace, and security agenda in ASEAN. So I guess that would be like the first uh, step for ASEAN to move forwards. And I see that there is this sort of institutional development within the ASEAN community framework itself that is more and more tolerant, I'd say permissible for ASEAN architecture to allow women's empowerment and the advancement of gender equality in the region. But also the fact that there is women leaders in ASEAN, like I put an example in my essay that one of the Indonesian foreign minister, the current Indonesian foreign minister, she is one of the, I would say, very feminist in a way, because she's also promoting in the country, in Indonesia itself, to increase more women to become female peacekeepers in the United Nations peacekeeping operations. And I guess with the presence of women leaders in ASEAN countries, that would also allow other ASEAN countries to see that this is the best practices that other countries should follow. And I'm very optimistic in a way that I think in the near future, I'd say 3 or 5 years from now, ASEAN would have its own regional action plan. Yeah, but um, I'm also I also realize there are a lot of limitation and challenges, as ASEAN is just an intergovernmental organization that still stick to the idea of this national sovereignty and stuff. So we can't really push every nation, every member states to actually adopt its own national action plan. But I guess having a regional action plan as the basis to develop national action plan would be the way forward for ASEAN in the future.
Thank you, Amar. Let's move to another region in the world, Latin America. And I want to ask Paula and Tamya, what role do you actually see for the OAS, the Organization of American States? And why is it that the OAS has not developed a national action plan on WPS, even though it actually has quite a strong gender equality office? I don't know who wants to start us off, Paula?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important question, which I see that is still open to academic debate. We don't have much analysis as to why exactly the OAS was not able to really engage with WPS frameworks. I mean, we have one important reference, which is Mary Meyer's chapters on the Oxford Handbook on WPS that pretty much tracks how the organization has been dealing with 1325. And I agree with her analysis. No, she basically, shows how there is this bifurcated approach about security, with basically one strand adopting a more traditional security focus, looking at national security, and another one dealing with citizen/public security. And although, both of these policy areas have not dealt very strongly with violence against women in the past. I mean, in the more recent debates, violence against women was actually inserted into debates on citizen and public security. So there is a tendency by OAS member states to attach these debates as internal related matters. So our interpretation is that it would boil down to these different interpretations on the scope of WPS agenda, with some OAS member states preferring to use WPS as a normative framework to guide their foreign policy while avoiding as much as possible international scrutiny over domestic issues. Right, Tamya?
Tamya?
Yes, I totally agree with Paula. And It's important just to remember that in Latin America, it's very difficult to get or to reach to a common definition of security. So if we are thinking about gender debates and security, which is where we tend to see gender debates being localized in Latin America, we get to the point that countries in Latin America have a very difficult time, actually in defining and having a common interpretation of what they consider matters of security. And by putting that aside, they tend to marginalize gender debates, and overall the women-based security agenda tend to be localized in the very far environment when we are talking about a more collaborative process or a more collaborative approach in terms of Latin America.
Kayla?
Okay, and I think moving kind of to a very global look, Esther, you proposed that those non-permanent members who want to be elected to the UN Security Council must fulfill certain requirements, including have a national action plan. Could you expand a little bit on how that would work? And additionally, you also advocate for a new WPS climate resolution. I'd love if you could kind of tell us why.
Yes, thank you so much for your question. So the UN Security Council, in case anyone in our audience doesn't know, has 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members who are elected each year by the General Assembly, which is made up of all the UN member states. This election takes place with a 2/3 majority, so 2/3 of states are required to elect the non-permanent members. And in addition, there has to be a geographical balance so that all continents are always represented. So I think the most straightforward way to make sure that the countries which get elected to the non-permanent positions on the council are supportive of the women, peace and security agenda would be to build a coalition of the willing among states in the General Assembly, to just negotiate, starting with states which support this agenda, and get as many states on board as possible in order to ideally get this 2/3 majority, but even just start by having a strong block of states which make this an issue, take it into account when voting, and advocate for it also with other states. And I'm not saying this is easy, but I think this would be a good way to try and make this happen. And in addition, this would also mean that, you know, progress on women, peace and security issues is rewarded. And I think this would also help build up normative pressure for change for states which aren't on board with the agenda yet. As for climate change, I think the climate emergency is one of the greatest challenges ahead for absolutely everyone and each and every one of us. We know that it has a very strong and very gendered impact on peace and security issue. It's already driving a lot of forced displacement. So I think a resolution tying gender, peace and security and climate change would lay the groundwork for both normative and real change by giving this issue visibility, changing the language around it, and legitimizing the work that is being done and probably will have to continue being done on this.
Thank you, Esther. To finish off our first round, last question to you, Andrea. Andrea, you have emphasized that the WPS agenda has been, you know, framed as a women's agenda. And even when it considers gender, it looks at gender in a very traditional binary way of men and women. And I think you make a very strong case of why we should make this agenda more inclusive, why it is important to make this agenda more inclusive. But can you talk a little bit about how to do that besides, you know, talking to LGBTQ plus people, talking about LGBTQ plus people? What else can we do to make this agenda more inclusive?
Thank you. And I think that's a great question that really leads on from more high-level conversations about pure representation to really talking about what it means to have meaningful representation. So in my piece, I basically argue that if there were more queer people, especially transgender, non-binary, and third gender people at the negotiating table at all levels, either in the Security Council of Civil Society briefers, within civil society organizations, or in member governments, we'd be able to, I think, better see in a really stark way the ways in which gender stereotypes don't actually work for anyone, including cisgender and heterosexual women as well. And I think that's at the core of what Women, Peace, and Security aims to achieve, is to really nuance the idea of who are agents in conflict and peace building and who are victims in conflict and peace building. And often there's overlap between the two. And so I think that starting with greater representation of people who tend to fall in cultural liminal spaces opens space for everybody to talk about the ways in which none of us really fit perfectly into these stereotypes. And so I think the proximate goal is greater representation, better inclusion, not just of queer people, but of a diverse range of women, and speaking to women not just for their social roles, their roles as wives, their roles as mothers, but women as individuals, and valuing that, with the broader goal, I think, of a more cultural change that recognizes that the conversation is about nuancing masculinity and femininity rather than just getting women and queer people to sit at the table where decisions are being made. But the first step to that is representation, and then meaningfully implementing what we learn from the representation.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I think you're making a very important point we should all take to heart. Kayla, shall we launch the second video?
Hi everyone, my name is Agathe Christien and I'm a consultant with the World Bank and a former research fellow with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. In my essay, I share some lessons learned from the last 2 decades of implementation of the WPS agenda and offer recommendations on what we can do moving forward for better implementation of the current framework. We know that while women are left out of formal peace processes, they play major roles in informal peace processes and grassroots efforts. So we need to better connect the various peace processes and diplomatic tracks, but also provide resources for women to actively participate in them. Other recommendations in my essay include focused on peacekeeping or countering violent extremism. Some of the recommendations included, first, the need to address and to integrate climate change to the agenda. And this can be done, for example, by using gender-responsive and climate-resilient approaches in post-conflict reconstruction. Another one would be to move from a women, peace and security framework to a gender peace and security framework. Adopting a gender peace and security framework in the 2020s would better address the gender impacts of conflict on both women and men from all backgrounds. So in conclusion, this anniversary is the time to draw lessons learned from the past 20 years and see what we can do moving forward to bring transformative change towards gender equality and respond better to an evolving peace and security threat landscape.
Hi, my name is Annina Claessen. I am a graduate student focusing on human rights and media studies at Sciences Po in Paris. And my essay focuses precisely on the role of the media sector in promoting the goals of UNSCR 1325. Too often, I would argue, the media is considered a neutral conduit through which the work of real policy actors is conveyed, but in actuality, the media is the only actor with the capacity to influence every single other actor in society. When it comes to gender-related issues in conflict settings, which is inextricable from deep trauma, including rape as a war crime or other forms of gender-based violence, the media often falls into sensationalism and exploitation. So I believe that we need to evoke Jake Lynch's and Annabelle McGoldrick's concept of peace journalism. Whenever a journalist chooses which stories to report on and how, they need to consider how their work can enhance prospects for peace, but also intersecting this with a gender perspective, enhancing the prospects for gender justice. And I would operationalize this aim in calling for a new code of media ethics on gender and conflict specifically. I also propose that the process of formulating such a code and its precise contents could serve as an act of mobilization in itself, creating alliances between media, civil society, and international community, representing various regions and intersecting perspectives and identities in this process. And it also happens to be a very straightforward way of extending the reach of the principles behind UNSCR 1325.
Hello everyone, my name is Carla Derpic and I work as project manager in the area of social sustainability and integrity at the UN Global Compact Network UK. The title of my essay is How the Private Sector Can Advance UNSCR 1325 in the 2020s. What this essay argues is that the private sector should become one of the actors driving forward the women, peace and security agenda in the 2020s. Research shows that women's economic empowerment has a significant positive knock-on effect on local, national and global economic development. Economic development in turn has the potential to enhance political and business stability, as well as women's societal and political empowerment. As such, supporting the women, peace and security agenda could be beneficial for businesses of all kinds. However, ever since the adoption of UNSCR 1325, the potential of the private sector to contribute to its advancement has remained largely untapped. The good news is that the global corporate social responsibility infrastructure that could support corporate WPS-related initiatives is already in place. In brief, my essay argues that the WPS agenda is good for business and that businesses have a lot to gain from contributing to empowering women towards peace and security in conflict-affected areas, as long as this is done in a sensible and responsible manner.
Hello, my name is Tabitha Mwangi and I'd love to talk to you about my paper titled Engagement of Women in Dialogue with Terrorist and Violent Extremist Groups. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions on women, peace and security have acknowledged the role of women in preventing and countering violent extremism. Dialogue should be explored as a way of dealing with these conflicts effectively. I argue that the deliberate involvement of women in dialogue processes with terrorist organizations is going to be effective to not only achieve Resolution 1325, but also effectively deal with terrorism across the world. My paper makes 3 recommendations. Number 1, involve women in dialogue processes to ensure that root causes of conflicts are addressed. Number 2, acknowledge women's leadership. If we don't involve them, then they will not be useful as access points to understanding the needs and priorities of their communities. Number 3, continue conducting more research on women and terrorism. This is because women are not a homogeneous group. In conclusion, given that the exclusive use of force has proved to be unsustainable and ineffective, dialogue as an alternative should be explored. This is not only because it will ensure that the achievement of 1325 is attained in the next decade, but it will also ensure that more women are protected, there is less violence, and more women are involved in peace and security processes in their communities. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Guðlaug Ólafsdóttir, or Gulla, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. The title of my essay is Promoting Women's Rights, Creating Conditions for Post-Conflict Peace. It builds on findings from research that show a strong correlation between gender inequality and armed conflict. It also builds on research that has shown that conflict is often gendered and has quite gendered outcomes. The essay then suggests that policies that promote women's rights or that aim to promote women's rights in post-conflict scenarios need to take this into account. The argument that I put forward is that the adoption and enforcement of women's rights is conducive to conflict risk mitigation if these rights are actively espoused by domestic civil society and promoted among men as well as women. Civil society actors are essential in this. Not only do they bring local knowledge, but they also give legitimacy to these issues. The recommendations then are to assist local civil society organizations in lobbying for change in legislation. It's also important to implement locally informed and inclusive programs that foster gender equality. So one issue is that these programs often focus a lot on women and don't necessarily talk as much to men. Where gender roles have kind of been shaped to promote militarized masculinity, it's really important to address this as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, congratulations for all of you of being so succinct in bringing your arguments forward. Agathe, let me start with you, and I don't know if any of you want to have a comment on the poll that we had. If you do, you can maybe integrate that in your answer. But Agathe, I want to start with you because that makes a very nice link also to the previous round. You also stressed the fact that we need to broaden the WPS agenda, that we need to talk about gender, not just women, and that we need to integrate climate change into this agenda. You also talk about climate resilient approaches, and I wonder if you could talk and explain to us what you mean by that.
Sure. Yes, so as was said before, the WPS agenda focuses too narrowly on women and sometimes seen as the homogeneous group, and doesn't sufficiently take into account the diversity of women and gender roles. But however, we know that, for example, in the security sector, for example, barriers to women's meaningful participation include patriarchal cultures and toxic masculinity. And this is linked to cases of sexual violence, for example, in some UN peacekeeping missions and perpetrated by peacekeepers themselves. So basically adopting a gender, peace and security framework would be more comprehensive, and we also need to engage male allies in this process. Now, as for climate change, as was said before, we know that conflict and climate change exacerbate inequalities and disproportionately affect women and girls, especially in climate vulnerable sectors of the economy like agriculture. So in terms of the UN Security Council resolution, we have 2242, which is part of the WPS agenda, and recognize that climate change was a global threat to peace and security. But I think that this should be taken more into account moving forward, and especially in implementation. So, for example, when it comes to the recovery pillar and reconstruction in the aftermath of conflict, well, I think we should use and adopt both gender responsive and climate resilient approaches. And so what I mean concretely by that is that, for example, by building the capacity of women to navigate climate vulnerable sectors like through climate smart agriculture or clean energy. And this will help both like economic recovery from conflict, women's economic empowerment, but also climate change mitigation.
Thank you. And Annina, I was wondering, you want to bring in the media and develop a new media code of ethics on gender and conflict. Have you talked with journalists or editors about this? Could you give us a little glimpse of what their reactions are, if you have?
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And on a broader scale, I would highlight that a few sort of high-profile incidences of frankly, very drastic and striking violations of human rights when it's come to how women in conflict settings have been reported on have attracted quite a lot of momentum very recently. I would highlight Professor Janine Di Giovanni at Yale University that I spoke to briefly, who's been proposing a new code of ethics specifically on conflict reporting, because a sort of code of ethics, it's not a legally binding set of rules. It's rather a familiar framework to journalists who know the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics when it comes to the basic principles of the practice of journalism. And in my own research, I focus more on violence that is perpetrated against women journalists specifically in terms of harassment or physical threat or online abuse. And I should highlight that these sort of inequality regimes are reinforced within newsrooms themselves. You often see white men at the upper management of hierarchies. They do not necessarily have any financial incentives with the way that media is in crisis right now, but also just with technological advancement, the 24-hour news cycle, there's very little incentive to just stop and consider the ethics of what you're doing and how your media company functions. So there's a long way to go in terms of both changing structures within the media sector and just raising awareness. I'd say right now there is a very low level of basic awareness on gender issues, conflict issues, and not even mentioning
the WPS agenda or using these words. So a sort of general occasion to get together, offer trainings, offer sort of conferences. I believe that international organizations could offer a great deal of convening power in this regard, can help in itself to start working on these issues within the media sector.
Thank you very much, Annina. And actually, Carla, I would like to ask you a similar question. You're somebody who wants to bring in a new actor, namely the private sector. So have you had any contacts and talks with corporations? Were they receptive to your ideas? And in the Q&A, there is also a question about, have you been thinking about these private social media actors? And I think Annina and you afterwards should talk about that, the two of you. Carla.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I have indeed had contact with businesses and corporations who are interested in the WPS agenda. So as I mentioned, I work for the UN Global Compact Network UK, which is the world's largest corporate sustainability and social responsibility initiative. And in the UK specifically, we have more than 400 businesses in our membership, and many of them are very engaged on gender equality issues and diversity and inclusion more broadly. But so far, not a lot of them have known about WPS. So I recently organized 2 webinars specifically on the topic on how the private sector can start to engage with WPS. And we have had lots of interest in these events with more than 100 registrations per webinar. And here we also managed to showcase some real life examples of businesses doing good in this space, even though they weren't necessarily framing it as WPS related projects. So for example, we showcased an example of a company called Committed to Good, which operates in many conflict affected countries. And they have this program called Female First, which aims to empower more women through employment in the humanitarian and development sector in these fragile contexts. And as to the question on whether they are receptive to the idea of becoming involved as an actor in the WPS agenda, like I said, we've seen lots of interest in it, but I think UNSCR 1325 and the WPS agenda are still a bit of an unknown to many businesses, as opposed to, for example, the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is still some doubt and hesitation as to how they can actually start positively contributing to it and how that work is going to be perceived. Given that the WPS agenda is such a sensitive and complex one and has to be approached in a really sensitive way. So I think I might just turn to the question now in terms of what are the roles and responsibilities of social media companies or media outlets. So I think if it's okay, I would like to share in the chat a recent report that UNICEF did on how to promote positive gender roles in marketing and advertising. Reports and guidance notes such as these are always helpful for businesses who want to do more in this space, even though they don't necessarily frame it as working in the WPS space. And so that can always be a good starting point for media related companies who want to do good in this space. And as to whether it would be beneficial for government bodies to frame WPS as a national security issue in order to promote private sector involvement, I think it would largely depend on each country. So I think, for countries who are really doing, who are really making good progress on WPS, perhaps framing it as a national security issue wouldn't make as much sense as for some other countries where, women's rights and women's empowerment should really be the priority, which should come from the top. So I think that would have to be done on a case-by-case basis, but I think it's certainly a very good recommendation and something that should be taken into account, especially at high level fora like the UN.
Yeah,
Thank
if I
you.
may.
Oh, sorry.
Media comment, if that's okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
I think it's very important to bring it up because I'd say all of the challenges that applied to the media sector, the traditional media houses, everything is even more difficult when it comes to social media platforms, because they are operating by different rules. They don't curate in the same way, and they'd have, even less, and in fact, minuscule level of transparency. But at the same time, we know that and I think we're now starting to have the discussion on the potential destructive role of democracy, that a lack of social media platform oversight and these dynamics are playing out. And I think there's a lot to be gained from the sort of momentum that's been building on disinformation in particular, and seeing there are initiatives like the Reporters Without Borders Journalism Trust Initiative that works to bringing together traditional media, social media platforms, and working together, an ecosystem of more trustworthy information. And I think looking at these and seeing how we can adapt them to the WPS framework would be helpful.
Thank you to both of you. I think that was a really interesting discussion on some, new actors that can be brought into this. Going to something that's been in the WPS agenda since 2015, Tabitha, terrorism and violent extremism have been part of the WPS agenda since 2015, but you would like to see the UN play a greater role. Could you expand on why and what exactly you would like the UN to do, please?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. In my paper, I argue that my recommendations will be best implemented by the United Nations through their seated unit. This is because I believe that the United Nations is able to easily work with all member states of the United Nations. And if they can take up this agenda of, for instance, acknowledging the role of women's leadership, involving more women in dialogue, then they're able to reach out to more communities than individual states would. It's also important that the United Nations is at the forefront of this, because one of their main responsibilities is to maintain international peace and security. So if they can take up this role even more than they're already doing, then we will see a decade of less terrorism across the world. And we will see also more women involved in peace and security issues, which would be a win-win situation. The way I advocate for the UN to be involved is because it's through one, for instance, advocating for more research on the nexus between terrorism and women. And this goes back to echo what Christien said when she mentioned that women are not a homogeneous group. And given the United Nations ability to reach different grassroots through their partnerships with different states, with different civil society organizations, it's a very effective tool of being able to understand the differences amongst women and using that as a vehicle to advocate for the acknowledgement of women's leadership, because we have to remember that women will always be involved and keep negotiating for what they want in their societies. We can either let them do that through peaceful means, or they will use violent means to do that. And it will be more effective if the United Nations will work with them to work towards peace by engaging them more in the peace and security agenda. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Last question for you, Gula. You emphasized that actually one of the most important findings we had in the 21st century, I think, is that there is such a strong relationship between how a state treats its women and the peacefulness of a state, or if you want, the relationship between gender inequality and armed conflict. You also point to the importance of civil society and gender equality legislation. So in terms of gender equality legislation, are there actually still a lot of states that have no gender equality legislation? And in terms of civil society, civil society is under attack in many parts of the world. And what can we do to keep civil society engaged on this issue? Gula.
Thank you. So, I mean, of course, we've made a lot of progress, and that ties into the discussion that we had earlier, and many good points were made about a lot of progress has been made across the world, also in terms of legislation. for women's rights, but there's still a long way to go. And a lot of the time legislation that's put forward is relatively vague and sometimes doesn't address all of the kind of aspects of women's rights, and it doesn't necessarily lead to strong enough laws that can be then drawn upon by local actors to enforce the implementation and enforcement of women's rights. For instance, we can see this, I mean, even in places where women's rights have been stronger previously, they are being rolled back, like in Poland right now. The role of civil society is essential, I would say. Not only do civil society actors provide really essential knowledge about their own local communities, but they also give strong legitimization to these issues. So sometimes women's rights as a kind of idea is dismissed as some kind of something that's being imposed by external actors. But if, I mean, therefore, we need to strengthen the civil society actors that are already fighting for this. And women's rights groups exist all over the world, and they're strong and they're resilient. But a lot of the time, they're also facing challenges in terms of funding. And the UN really plays or the international community more generally, really plays a really important role in making sure that they can be sustained and that they can also implement programs throughout their countries and not necessarily only in one area. So my essay focuses on particularly kind of post-conflict contexts, given that these particular contexts, women's rights is still really important to be promoted for the sake of both, mitigating discrimination and mistreatment of women more generally. But it's also important to keep in mind that these contexts also are shaped by the conflicts. And oftentimes this gives rise to tensions that in the aftermath can create a backlash against women. And women's rights programming needs to really be sensitive to this and take this into account. And I think one important way to do this is to implement them broadly and not only talk to women, because this might risk exacerbating and actually making some of these tensions worse. So it's important to address or to talk more broadly, as we've heard by previous participants, to talk about gender equality more broadly and talk about gender more broadly, and definitely to talk to men and to talk about militarized masculinities and the issues that this brings to everyone in society, really. Because if we don't remove these kind of hinders toward the implementation and the kind of acceptance or support for women's rights, which militarized masculinity certainly poses, we might risk kind of causing more harm than we aimed for. So that's kind of the essence of my essay.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and I want to sort of group them together and then ask each of you. You don't all have to answer all these questions, but maybe some of you want to react to the. So there's one question about transitional justice and the connection to the WPS agenda and the importance of transitional justice. There's another question and actually a bunch of questions that relate to the lack of enforcement mechanisms. I mean, I think one of the things that we have seen is that, politicians are good in making bold declarations and making commitments on paper, but then implementation is not following. So what can we do about that implementation problem? There are a lot of questions related to the issue of social media and how we can, enforce an ethic on social media. A question in terms of diaspora investment, and I think, Carla, you already saw that question. And then more general, and I think it's a little bit for all of you, you know, this agenda, and whenever we talk about this agenda, mostly women. So how do we bring in men? How do we bring in more Amars in this discussion? And I'm sure that all of you have some idea. So who would like to start us off, either on transitional justice, implementation, diaspora, social media, or how to bring in men? Just raise your hand like that. Yes, Tabita.
I'd like to speak about the issue of transitional justice, and before I do that, I'd like to explain in a few seconds what the essence of my paper is. The main argument behind my paper is using dialogue to deal with violence. This is because in the past, dialogue has been very effective. If we think of a country like Northern Ireland, where dialogue was essentially used to bring about peace that has lasted for many decades. So that's proof that dialogue is a very effective tool. And thinking about the issue of transitional justice and how people should commemorate certain events that happen, how to make more inclusive peace in our communities, I believe that dialogue is a very effective tool, because dialogue helps people to discuss the root causes of violence and conflict in their societies. It helps people to bridge the gap between themselves and their states, so that they're all working together and not having this gap where people feel like the state is very disconnected from the reality that they're living in. And it also helps to help appreciate diversity and diverse views. So it helps the states to understand what people are really going through, and people to understand the role of the government and some of the challenges that some governments face. Therefore, thinking about transitional justice, you can't have that without dialogue at the essence of it, because it will help to have meaningful conversations that help people determine their future. It helps people forgive and helps people to know how to best move forward as a group after something tragic has happened, as opposed to sweeping things under the rug, having a certain memory that's forced on people by governments, and that only fuels the conflict in societies. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Amar.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I would like to address the question in regard to how states make this declaration and stuff, but then it remains on the paper and there's no follow-up kind of thing in terms of the action. I guess that really resonates with what happened in ASEAN, really. Like ASEAN has produced a lot of declaration and also consensus kind of thing, but then most of them like remains on the paper. And I guess in the context of women, peace and security agenda, I guess the way to move forward is to actually bring more women leaders, or like women into the position of leader in ASEAN countries. And I see that there are a lot of potential for ASEAN countries to actually doing it. We have female president in Singapore. We have the state chancellor in female state chancellor in Myanmar. We also have Indonesian foreign minister, and more women leaders actually in the position of power. And I guess that would disrupt the, I don't know, this masculinity kind of thing, hierarchies in the state power relations. So I guess that would be one thing to address that, to bring more women into position of power. So I guess women would, the involvement of women in the position of power would somehow make those declaration into practice. I'm not saying that men won't do that, but I guess this is something related to disrupting gender relations and state relations. And I would say state also somehow the violent actor against women. And I guess bringing women leaders more to this issue would be one alternative solution. And I guess to have more men to discuss the women, peace and security agenda. I mean, personally, I'm really interested in this issue because I sort of like inspired by my mother, and that's it. And I see my mother as my role model and stuff. But then after that, I would say by studying gender kind of issues and gender courses, providing more courses on this kind of issue, and targeting men as the students to involve in this kind of courses would also at least open up discussion. And in fact, I'd say men also realize that this world is not only for men but also for women. So yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So we're nearing to the end of our webinar. As you know, the Security Council is nearing its end of its open debate. And I want to ask all of you, and take 10, 20 seconds. If you have one recommendation, we can zoom in right away to the Security Council. What would it be that you would tell them? And I'm going to go in the order of my screen, and I'm starting with Gula. 20 seconds.
Thank you. Yeah, my recommendation would be to always implement programs inclusively. So include both women and men when talking about these issues, talk about gender, not only women's rights, but also really support local civil society organizations that are pushing for this, because they are essential players in this.
Okay, great. Esther.
Yes, I'm going to echo what was just said a bit. I think someone from the audience said in a question which was written, and very rightly so, that the importance of civil society actors is something which we found in the whole volume, in all of our essays, and that everyone agrees on quite rightly. So I think just that decision makers listen more to civil society actors and act on what is said, because we have the knowledge, we know what needs to be done. A lot of the time, we know how to best do it. We just need to do it.
Okay, thank you. Annina.
Right. I would argue for implementing and learning from successful sort of broader frameworks that actually mobilizes policy, namely the numerous feminist foreign policy initiatives that we have seen, but with the absolute aim of an anti-militaristic agenda, and not just focusing on a deeper level to on the root causes of gender inequality and conflict, and not just focusing on band-aid solutions or a pretty coat of paint.
Thank you. Carla.
Thank you. My recommendation would be to just engage as many relevant stakeholders as possible in working towards achieving the goals of the WPS agenda. So engage not only governments, not only UN agencies, not only regional organizations and NGOs, but also local governments, private sector, youth organizations, and really any other actors who could help drive progress. And this is mainly because multilateralism and cooperation should be the bedrock of any important local agenda and global agenda, and working together to raise awareness of UNSCR 1325 is crucial if we want to make progress on a global scale and also achieve progress towards other important global goals and initiatives such as women's empowerment principles and the SDGs.
Great. Andrea?
Of course. So to echo what everyone's been saying about the importance of civil society, I think if I were speaking to the Security Council right now, I would urge that they're always cognizant of who they invite to speak from civil society, to pay attention to diversity, to invite women to speak on all issues, not just women, peace, and security, as well as inviting more queer people to speak on all issues, not just women, peace, and security, to really bring that dialogue that's happening on a civil society level up to the decision-making sphere. Thank you.
Great. Agathe?
Yes, I would say focus on the implementation gaps. For example, women only represent about 13% of negotiators in peace negotiations. Gender provisions in peace agreements fail to be implemented in many cases. So focus on these implementation gaps and set ambitious targets. So it could be setting quotas for all UN-backed negotiations around peace and reconstruction, for example.
Great. Paula?
So I would highlight, I mean, in addition to echoing what my fellow panelists have said, I would really highlight the need for adequate funding from government and donors to ensure the fulfillment of WPS commitments. I think a key issue that we are seeing now here in Brazil is how lack of funding creates obstacles, not only for effectiveness, but also for continuity, so WPS can thrive despite changes in government and in leadership. So this would be my main recommendation.
Great. Tabby?
I will tell the United Nations Security Council to advocate for more use of dialogue in terms of dealing with counterterrorism issues, because dialogue has the potential to effectively address the root causes of violence and to include women across all levels of dialogue, so that they're not only added as a by the way or as an afterthought, because the deliberate involvement of women is a very effective way of handling the stalemate that the exclusive use of force has seen us see at the moment that we are living.
Great. Anna?
Thank you. Well, I would say I would invite the 5 permanent members and all the other non-permanent members from the Global North to ask themselves how safe are women in their own countries, I mean, all women in their own countries, to stop perhaps to stop replicating this focus of the Global South as women to be safe, as countries that are permanent focus of its instability, and to, I think a good place to start acknowledging that all women must be considered also in the Global North is actually asking the NGOs or the journalists that are doing the hard work in understanding their issues in their own countries.
Great. Amar?
I guess I'd say to enhance partnership, like to linking this local and global. So like put emphasis on that role of civil society in these peace processes.
And Tamya, the last word for you.
So I would actually be another voice in raising the importance of civil society in pushing forward the agenda. And I think also important is investing in education, in policies and programs, so we can have more awareness about the WIIS security agenda in all levels, not only local, regional, and international. And I think education might be the key for this.
Thank you very much. It remains to me to remember that we have a volume with all the essays together, and you can find the link in the chat or on our website. And I really encourage you to read this volume. It's very inspiring. I also would like to thank also, I think, on behalf of Dominique, all of you for your terrific essays and for your participation in this discussion, which again, as I said, found very encouraging and inspiring. Dominique, do you want to have a last word?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was a great discussion, and also, again, thank you very much to WIIS for making this such a very dynamic discussion here today. I really enjoyed hearing the views of everyone here, to give each panelists a chance to give some proposals, and also the polls in between made this a very dynamic event. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much to everyone.
Okay, so thank you to everyone, and we look forward to staying in touch with all of you. You're now part of the WIIS family, and we won't let go of you. So I hope to see all of you very soon. Bye-bye.